So our system, as it often does, has consequences. And one of the struggles that we've had in expanding diversity and representation is that our rules of elections make that more difficult than some other systems of government. Because we have single member districts, that doesn't give you a lot of choices on who to vote for. No quotas. Our Congress doesn't have term limits, so there's not a natural end to someone's professional career in Congress. There's a huge incumbency advantage that keeps people in office for decade after decade. And we still have to confront a social bias that exists in who's going to run. So let's look at each of these individually. Single member districts, if you're going to vote for the Senate, and it's, District 29, you have a choice between Josh Newman, the Democrat, and Ling Chang, the Republican. So if you are a Democrat, you're going to vote for the white guy. Ideology over identity politics. So even if you think, I think it's really important that we have more women in politics, you might not be likely to vote for the woman in this race because she's a Republican and not going to vote for the things you as a Democrat want. If you're Republican, even if you're a white man who doesn't care at all about identity politics, you're probably going to vote for the woman of color in this race. Single member districts doesn't give you a lot of choice. You are going to vote for the candidates before you. Compare that to a parliament where you vote for the party that you want, and then the party has a list of candidates. And often parliaments will enforce that with quotas. Either there are reserved seats, in Iraq, when the United States helped write that constitution, we instituted a 25% quota for women. 25% of the seats in the legislature had to be held by women. Now, often how they do that is through the party list. So if there are 53 seats in the House of Representatives and we had a parliament system, which we don't, the Democrats would come up with a list of 53 candidates. The Republicans would come up with a list of 53 candidates. And depending how many seats were won by each party, you would then, the party, not individual candidates, the party would choose which candidates were going to get seated. And so it's easy when you have a list of 53 to put women at the top of that list, to put people of color at the top of that list, to put whatever diversity and demographics are important to you. If you want to have younger people elected, you move them to the top of the list. And so they are going to get seated before some of the other folks. It works best with a parliamentary system. It's hard to have a quota when you have single member districts, and it's all dependent on who runs. So we do struggle with that because of our system of elections in the House of Representatives, in the California Assembly, the California Senate. Those are all single member districts. So it's hard to have any sort of quota when each individual election is an individual event. The fact that we don't have term limits in Congress means that people serve, as long as they're getting reelected. And so when Congress looks like the 1960s or the 1970s, often that's because that's when those folks first got elected. It's pretty easy to rack up 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years when you don't have term limits in our House of Representatives or our Senate. California has term limits, and so our legislators only serve for 14 years in either the California Assembly or the California Senate, or you can divide up your years and have a combination of both. So California has more diversity, has more young people, has more professional diversity, people coming from all kinds of walks of life. We have, teachers and ER doctors and farmers, far more professional experience than you see in Congress, which tends to be dominated by, professional politicians, lawyers, people who have dedicated their career to serving as legislators. There's also a huge incumbency advantage. If you are in the House of Representatives and you run for re-election, you've got a 95% re-election rate. We have incredibly safe seats that are drawn to give incumbents an advantage. It's really tough to be a challenger. And so that extends the number of years that members of the House serve. That's a big barrier to turnover. There's also just social bias. Women are less likely to run. Most of the women in politics, if you ask them, how they got involved, most of them will tell you that, somebody asked them to run, somebody recruited them. Women with children, especially small children, face criticism. How dare you leave your children? But when we actually research it, it turns out that matters. That work-life balance is tough for women, particularly depending on how far away the capital is, how far that commute is. And so in state legislators, we see that in smaller states where legislators can go home at night with part-time legislators or a short commute, more women are elected. And so a lot of those smaller states on the East Coast have far more female representation than you see in Congress, where, depending on where you live, Hawaii or Alaska or California, it's a really long commute. And so either you're moving your family to Washington and then when you come to your home district, you're leaving your family at home, or the reverse, where you're leaving the family at home and leaving for long periods of time. Even in Sacramento, the closer you are to Sacramento, the more likely you have more women running, even though, it's a fairly short flight home, but you're probably spending 4 days in the capital and 3 days in your home district. It's also it's kind of a 24/7 job. You're off and on, even when you're in public. People feel that they can approach you, and there's a lot of events, and so that makes it difficult. Recruiting for the farm team, not only for women but also for candidates of color, is underrepresented. Candidates is really important too. Usually your first election is not running for Congress. Usually you run for school board or you run for city council. You're on a commission in your local community. And so getting that farm team, making sure that there are women candidates of color that are getting elected to low community offices, and then they're ready to get elected to the assembly. And when you think about, the number of years that you're talking about, if we get young people to run for school board, maybe you spend 4 or 8 or 12 years on the school board and you run for city council. So maybe you're doing 8 years on the school board and 8 years on the city council. That's 16 years. So if you were 25 or 30 when you started, now maybe your kids are older and maybe you can run for the assembly, or you can spend a little bit more time once the kids are in college. And so getting that farm team, that pipeline of candidates who are qualified for higher office, is really crucial too. And particularly because so many women are likely to sit out until somebody else suggests it, that recruiting becomes really important. Let me get this.
When I first ran for public office, which was now over 20 years ago, although my youngest was a senior in high school, the question I was most frequently asked was, who's going to be taking care of your children? And of course, it's one of those questions that I don't think a man has ever been asked when he has run for office.
The big example that people use when we talk about substantive representation is Ted Kennedy. Ted Kennedy is sort of the stereotypical privileged white male who had his job given to him. His dad actually, he wasn't yet 30. You have to be 30 to be a United States senator. And so his brother, John Kennedy, was president, and their father had a family friend run for office and then conveniently step aside when Ted Kennedy turned 30, and on his birthday, I suppose, he was given a Senate seat from Massachusetts, and he held it until his death, decades later. Ted Kennedy is the epitome of the privileged white male, who's never had to work a day in his life for money. And yet when you look at his votes, when you look at his public policy positions, he spent a career fighting for healthcare for all, for minimum wage increases for social programs for the poor. And so if you're looking for somebody who is really looking for, civil rights and equality, healthcare and public policy, poverty reform, you had a solid vote with huge political power in Ted Kennedy. And so the idea that you would vote against Ted Kennedy, throw him out of office to get a woman or a person of color because of this idea of diversity, you have substantive representation with Ted Kennedy as a consistent ally. And that is not always what you get with, if you just look at demographics for demographics' sake. First of all, not everybody thinks the same. Often we think, if you elect a woman, they're going to be really concerned about women's issues. That's not true in any way. Individual women have different priorities and different ideologies. And so if you elect somebody who is pro-life, they are not going to be protecting birth control or reproductive rights when it comes to abortion, when it comes to the pro-choice movement. So it is a question that you have to ask about who you are electing and whether or not having a strong ally who votes consistently and gets the public policy that you want is more important than diversity. And it's not an either or. Clearly we can have both goals at the same time, but it is, crucial to understand that the ideology over identity politics, there's a huge political divide between Republicans and Democrats on a lot of public policy issues. And so you want to understand that as well as this question of diversity. Clearly, diversity matters when it comes to representation. Diversity matters when it comes to, this somewhat lofty goal of Congress looking like America. But it's also a question of, who will represent you substantially, who will vote the way you want them to vote. The big world of intersectionality means that you're almost never going to get somebody who represents every facet of your individual being. So you really do need to consider what the goals are when it comes to descriptive versus substantive representation, and how do you balance those objectives in a political and ultimately just in our society of who we're electing and who our leaders are. So I'm looking forward to a really good discussion about these kinds of concepts.